2 sets of dusty footprints led up the slope toward the weather-beaten barn, but it wasn't the prints that made Bear's skin crawl. It was the faint sound carried by the wind, the soft shuffle of bare feet, the low murmur of quiet voices speaking in a language older than the land itself. The sun was dipping low behind the jagged mesas, spilling molten gold over the endless plains, and there, by the cracked wooden door, stood a girl. She was no more than 12, maybe 13. Her clothes hung loose and threadbare, like they'd been stitched together from scraps found in the wilderness. Dirt stained her face, but it was her eyes that held Bear's attention, wide, sharp, and flickering with a kind of wary hope. Behind her, 3 younger children shuffled awkwardly, their faces pale and their limbs thin as twig branches. Bear's hand rested on the worn handle of his rifle, but his breath caught when he saw the strange, faded mark tattooed on the girl's wrist. A spiral, almost like a secret brand. A mark he thought he had buried years ago, with the ghosts of a past he tried to forget. 200 Comanche warriors don't just show up at your barn by accident. They come for blood, for justice, or for war. But this was neither. It was something quieter, more fragile, a plea. Bear lowered his rifle slowly. "All 4 of you. Get in the wagon." The girl glanced back over her shoulder, the youngest sibling clutching her ragged sleeve. The sun's last light caught on the hills, casting long shadows across the dry earth. Somewhere behind them, a coyote's howl split the silence. The land here was hard and unforgiving, the kind of place that tested a man's soul with every sunrise. Bear had come west 10 years ago. A greenhorn looking for a fresh start after the war left his heart bruised and heavy. He found solace in the dusty trails and endless horizons of the frontier, where the wind sang through the sagebrush and the sky stretched wide enough to swallow your troubles whole. His ranch was a patch of earth carved from the wild, a modest homestead with a corral, a weather-beaten cabin, and a barn that had seen better days. The land was still settling after the railroad pushed further west, bringing with it new settlers, lawmen, and trouble. Bear was a man of few words, a quiet figure who wore his scars like badges of honor. His neighbors called him gruff, but those who knew him understood the weight he carried beneath the rough exterior. He'd learned early on that kindness was a currency rarer than gold out here. The barn door creaked as the girl pushed it open, her siblings following close behind. Bear's eyes scanned their faces again. Hunger and fear mingled with something else, a stubborn flicker of resilience. "What's your name, little one?" Bear asked, voice low. "Lila," she whispered, barely audible. The children clung together like a fragile thread holding back a storm. Lila's gaze drifted toward the horizon, where dark clouds were gathering far off over the mesas. Bear felt the old ache settle deep in his chest, the kind that comes from remembering the promises broken and the lives lost on these very plains. The mark on Lila's wrist stirred memories of a past he'd tried hard to leave behind. The raids, the bloodshed, the families torn apart in the endless struggle between settlers and native tribes. He knew the stories well. He'd heard whispers in town, tales of stolen children, of families scattered by violence and fear, but seeing it here, in front of him, was different. It was real. "Why are you out here, Lila?" Bear asked gently, stepping aside to let them into the barn's dim interior. Lila hesitated, then spoke in a voice small but steady. They said the soldiers came. Took Ma and Pa. Said we had to leave." The youngest, sibling, a boy no older than 6, whimpered softly. Bear's gaze softened despite the hardened edge he kept wrapped around his heart. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a piece of jerky. "Eat," he said, offering it without expectation. Lila's hand trembled as she took it. The smallest sister, clutching a threadbare doll, looked up with eyes too old for her age. Bear closed the barn door behind them, shutting out the fading light and the growing shadows of the plains. The wind shifted outside, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke and distant thunder. He could feel the weight of the coming storm. Not just the weather, but the one waiting to break over this quiet corner of the West. The kind of storm that forced men to choose between what was right and what was easy. As he settled the children near the warm hearth, Bear's mind drifted back to a time when the world was less complicated, when promises could still be kept. The flicker of firelight danced in Lila's eyes, reflecting a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance for kindness in a land forged by hardship. Outside, the wind whispered through the tall grass, and somewhere, a faint drumbeat began to rise. Bear sat by the flickering fire, the barn's shadows casting long shapes over the children huddled close together. Lila kept a protective arm around her youngest brother, while the two other siblings sat stiffly, eyes darting toward the darkened windows. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken questions. He reached for a chipped tin cup and poured warm water from a kettle, handing it to Lila. She accepted it with a careful grip, lips trembling as she took a slow sip. The others watched, wary but hungry for any sign of comfort. Bear's fingers brushed the faded spiral on Lila's wrist again. It was the same mark he'd seen years ago on the leader of a small Comanche band, a symbol tied to old promises and newer betrayals, the kind of mark that spoke of blood debts and the weight of history. He thought about the warnings he'd heard in town, murmurs from the Cess, Herif and the merchant, neighbors eyeing him with suspicion. A white man shouldn't be helping those who run from the law, one had said, voice low but harsh. Another had warned, if you shelter them, you're asking for trouble. But when Bear looked into Lila's eyes again, so full of desperation and trust, the town's judgment felt like a distant echo compared to the raw need before him. That night, as the children slept fitfully, Bear heard the whispered voices of the men in town, a mixture of fear, anger, and cold pragmatism. Old Tom, a grizzled rancher, spat by the saloon's swinging doors. He's gone soft. Helping them brings only death and dishonor. Martha, the schoolteacher, shook her head quietly. They're children. They didn't ask for this war. But the sheriff's words cut deeper. We can't let this go. The treaty's fragile. Any sign of harboring the enemy could spark a massacre. Bear leaned back against the barn wall, fingers tight on the worn handle of his rifle. He knew his choice would stir trouble, but the thought of turning these children away felt like a worse kind of sin. Days passed, and whispers spread through the settlement like wildfire. Some neighbors crossed their arms or averted their gaze when Bear passed. Others muttered curses under their breath. The mercantile owner even threatened to cut off supplies if Bear continued to shelter the Comanche children. But none of that stopped Bear from checking on Lila and her siblings every morning, breaking hard bread and sharing what little he had. He watched as their bodies slowly grew stronger, but their eyes never lost that wary shadow. One afternoon, a stranger arrived at the ranch. A tall man, sunburned and weather-beaten, with a badge pinned crookedly on his chest. The deputy sheriff. I hear you've been harboring those children, he said, voice low but firm. That's dangerous, Bear. You know what the town's saying. You're risking more than just your reputation. Bear met the man's gaze steadily. They're just kids. Maybe. But their people are out there, stirring trouble. You protect them, and you make enemies. Not just with the settlers, but with the law. The deputy's eyes flicked toward the barn. You don't want this to end badly. Bear nodded slowly. Neither do I. The man tipped his hat and left, leaving Bear to wrestle with the growing storm around him. That evening, As twilight seeped through the cracks in the barn walls, Lila sat beside Bear. She traced the lines on his weathered hand with delicate fingers. "They'll come," she said softly. "The warriors. They want us back." Bear swallowed the lump rising in his throat. "I know." She looked up, eyes fierce despite her youth. "Will you let them take us?" He hesitated. "I don't want to see more bloodshed." Lila's hand tightened. "Neither do I. But sometimes, kindness means standing your ground." Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of dry earth and smoke. Somewhere beyond the hills, drums echoed faintly, like a heartbeat growing louder in the distance. Bear knew the moment of reckoning was fast approaching, and with it, the fragile hope he had kindled in the hearts of 4 lost children would be tested by the unforgiving truth of the West. The first time Bear heard the hoofbeats, he was chopping wood near the creek, the sun still high but heat already thick in the air. A low rumble in the distance, steady and deliberate, not the casual clatter of riders passing by, but a purposeful arrival. He paused, axe in hand, eyes narrowing toward the horizon where dust stirred like a restless ghost. The scent of smoke drifted faintly, tinged with the sharp tang of sweat and earth, and his gut tightened. The Comanche were coming. Bear knew what this meant. They weren't just out hunting or wandering. This was a war party moving with intent. The kind of force that wouldn't tolerate a man caught sheltering their lost kin. Back at the barn, the children were huddled close. Lila stood by the doorway, scanning the darkening plains. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. "They're here," she said quietly. Bear nodded. "We have to be ready." Hours passed with the slow crawl of tension thickening every breath. The wind outside carried the faint beat of drums, rising and falling like a restless tide. Shadows lengthened and stretched like hungry fingers across the land. A scout's figure appeared briefly on a distant ridge, silhouetted against the dying light. Bear could almost hear the unspoken message in that lone rider's stance. They had come for their own. Inside the barn, Bear gathered his worn rifle and checked the cartridges carefully. The children's small faces watched him with silent questions. "Stay close," he whispered. As night bled into a deeper black, the first riders crested the hill. Their horses moved with a ghostly grace, eyes sharp and steady. The leader was unmistakable, tall, broad-shouldered, the spiral mark tattooed clearly on his forearm. Bear's breath hitched. This was the man whose name he dared not speak, the shadow from his past he thought long buried. The leader raised a hand in greeting, slow and deliberate, but the weight of the moment was heavy between them. The warriors fanned out in a silent perimeter, horses shifting uneasily beneath them. Bear stepped forward, hands raised slightly in peace. "We mean no harm," he said quietly. "The children, they're safe here." The leader's eyes bore into Bear's like burning coals, the years of grief and betrayal clear in their depths. After a long pause, he spoke in a voice low and low. "Ijud, you hid our blood. That is courage, or madness." Bear met the gaze without flinching. "I did what I thought was right." A tense silence stretched between the two men. The warriors exchanged glances but held their ground. Then the leader spoke again. "We do not come for war tonight. We come for kin." Lila stepped forward, voice barely above a whisper. "Please, we only want to go home." Bear watched as the tension slowly shifted, the rigid lines of suspicion softening just enough for hope to flicker. But even as the warriors relaxed, the distant howl of a coyote broke the stillness, a reminder that peace here was fragile, and the past never far behind. Bear's heart beat heavy with the knowledge that the night ahead would test all their courage. A quiet stand in the vast wilderness where old wounds ran deep and the future hung on a thread. The air was thick with unspoken questions. Would kindness be enough to bridge the divide? Or would the night end with broken promises and blood in the dust? The moon rose high over the plains, casting silver light on the silent faces gathered in the barn's shadow. And somewhere, beneath the endless stars, a new chapter of this land's story was about to unfold. The fire's warm glow flickered softly against the rough timber walls as the warriors settled outside the barn, their quiet murmurs blending with the night's stillness. Inside, Bear sat beside Lila, her small hand resting lightly in his. The youngest sibling slept against a bundle of blankets, and the others were silent, their eyes heavy with exhaustion, but alert to every sound beyond the walls. Bear studied Lila's face, worn beyond her years, but fiercely alive with a strength born of survival. The silence between them carried more than words ever could. It was a shared understanding of pain, loss, and the fragile hope that had brought them together. "She told me once," Bear began softly, voice low enough to not disturb the others, "that kindness was a kind of courage." Lila looked up, eyes meeting his. "It takes more courage to be kind than to fight," she said, "because kindness can be broken, but it's what makes us human." Bear nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling deep in his chest. The man who once saw the world through the sharp sights of a rifle now felt the quiet power of empathy stirring within him, a force stronger than any bullet. Outside, the leader of the Comanche approached the barn, his silhouette outlined by the firelight. He paused at the door, eyes meeting Bear's, with a mixture of respect and caution. "She is telling them," Bear said, "that judging you for your kindness would make us no better than the soldiers who kill without asking questions first." The warrior's gaze softened. He knelt by the fire, pulling a small, worn leather pouch from his belt. From it, he produced a tiny object, a small, faded photograph. Bear's breath caught as he recognized the tintype, a picture of a family long gone, faces etched with hope and sorrow. "This was Bear's most prized possession," the leader said quietly, "taken in a time when the world was simpler, before the wars, before the betrayals." Lila reached out, tracing the image with her finger. "Families can be torn apart," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "But they can also be healed." The fire crackled, and for a moment the barn became a sanctuary not just of shelter, but of shared humanity. Bear saw something shift in the faces around him, the fierce pride of warriors softened by the fragile thread of connection. The children, too, seemed to breathe easier, as if the night's darkness had lifted just enough to reveal a path toward peace. Hours slipped by in quiet conversation and unspoken understanding. Words were sparse but weighted, gestures small but meaningful. A shared meal passed between them, bread broken and passed hand to hand, a simple act of trust. When dawn's first light painted the sky in pale pink and gold, the warriors gathered their pair. "Forgotten." Lila hugged Bear tightly, tears slipping down her dirt-streaked cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered. Bear watched as the small band disappeared over the ridge, their figures swallowed by the morning haze. The weight of what had passed lingered, a quiet promise etched into the earth beneath their feet. The ranch, once just a lonely outpost on the vast plains, had become a place where enemies met as kin, if only for a moment, bound by a courage that transcended fear and hatred. And as the sun climbed higher, warming the land, Bear knew that sometimes the greatest battles were not fought with guns or fists, but with the quiet strength of kindness and the unspoken hope for a better tomorrow. The plains stretched wide and wild before him, full of promise and pain, shadow and light. And in that vastness, Bear found something he hadn't felt in years, a chance at redemption. The morning light seeped softly through the worn curtains of Bear's cabin, brushing the rough wooden floor with pale gold. Outside, the prairie stretched endless, the wind whispering through the tall grasses, as if carrying stories from long ago. Bear sat at the weathered table, hands wrapped around a cup of bitter coffee. The barn stood quiet behind him, its doors closed but heavy with memories. The children were gone, riding back with the Comanche warriors who had come for them, their small wagon disappearing over the distant hill like a fragile promise carried on the breeze. The years since that night had folded quietly into the rhythm of the land. Bear had never forgotten the eyes of those children, the mark on Lila's wrist, or the courage it took to stand in the face of fear. He learned that peace wasn't the absence of conflict, but the hard-won space between it. One evening, long after the wars had faded from the horizon, a figure appeared on the ridge. A young woman riding slowly toward the ranch. Her face was familiar, framed by the sun-kissed wind. It was Lila, grown now, her eyes still carrying the same fierce hope. She dismounted with 3 children of her own, each bearing the spiral mark on their wrists, a symbol not of old wounds, but of new beginnings. Bear stood at the gate, his heart tightening with a quiet pride. The girl who had once begged for food and shelter had become a bridge, a translator, a peacekeeper between worlds that history had tried to tear apart. Lila smiled, voice steady and sure. "We're home." The prairie wind carried her words, a soft promise to the land and the people who had shaped her story. And as the sun set behind the mesas, painting the sky in shades of fire and hope, Bear knew that kindness had not only saved lives, but had planted seeds for a future where understanding might grow. Years later, children would run freely across these plains, unburdened by the fears of their ancestors. And in quiet moments, Bear would remember the night the Comanche came not with war, but with kin, and the courage it took to answer with kindness instead of hate. The land kept turning, stories weaving through the endless sky, and sometimes, if you listened close, you could still hear the soft drumbeat of hope beneath the wind's song.